The attention of the whole world has been on the US trade war with China and indeed with the rest of the world. But back home in the United States, he is breaking things there as well and doing it on purpose, taking the hammer to all manner of institutions, including the latest ones, universities, particularly the top universities. Harvard hit with a $2.2 billion funding freeze after rejecting Donald Trump's demands for change. Can he force US universities to change? And what does their future look like if they don't? Welcome to Americast, back, after some delay in my case, on campus.
Americast from BBC News.
Hello, I'm Sumi, joining from the Washington, D.C. Bureau.
And it is Mariana, a.k.a. Misinformation, in the worldwide headquarters in London on my own.
And it's Justin at home in South London. And we've got to say what time it is, haven't we, and where we are, because, well, not just where we are, but what day it is as well, because so much changes, Mariana. So why don't you do the honours, because I worked so early this morning, I can't remember what time it is or what day it is.
Yeah, so we are recording this at just after 2:00 on Wednesday, and who knows what may have happened when this comes out, and particularly what might have happened regarding the elite universities in the United States, which is what we're chatting about today.
Yeah, so Sumi, here is my take on this. Can I start with a slight kind of tangential point?
Please.
I was looking the other day at what Donald Trump was saying.
The producers will be loving that.
They'll be loving it and they'll be used to it. And Donald Trump was the other day expounding his views on the subject of shower heads, which he's going to make great again. And I think he actually signed an executive order, correct me if I'm wrong, on the size of shower heads. So basically, yeah, so this whole business of the Biden administration on new housing said you've got to have shower heads that save more water. It's all an environmental thing, I think. And Donald Trump comes in saying, no, shower heads should be able to scald you and smash your back and all the rest of it.
It's about the water pressure, Justin. He wants good water pressure.
Yeah, okay. He wants good water pressure, because good water pressure is part of being a proper American. Again, that I just think those things, because my contention is that that's actually pretty popular, certainly popular with his supporters. And although we quite rightly talk a lot about the things where he is doing stuff that is quite possibly not popular, we've talked a lot about tariffs, a lot about the inflationary impact of tariffs, et cetera, and how that's going to affect him politically. At the same time, and I think it's worth getting to some of these things, at the same time, he is plugging away at things, often social, cultural things, but other things as well, that just, in the words of some of his supporters, are making America normal again. And it just struck me that the shower thing is one of those things, and at a different level, and I guess a much more important level, this battle with the universities is a battle that Donald Trump wants to have because, for political reasons, he thinks that he is on the side of most Americans. So I guess we should start by saying what it is that he is doing, and whether when he makes that calculation, he might have miscalculated.
Yeah, what Donald Trump and his administration say that they're doing is, on the one hand, bringing universities in line that they say have allowed anti-Semitism to flourish on campus. So remember, during the pro-Palestinian anti-war campus protests that we saw on campuses across the country, that we saw these protests really take over universities. And at the time, the Biden administration had a difficult time kind of really approaching this issue, because obviously these were protesters who were also calling not only on their universities, but on the country to take a different approach to supporting Israel in the war. And now the Trump administration says that these universities violated civil rights law because they weren't able to protect Jewish students, and they allowed, as I said, anti-Semitism to take root. And if you look at some of these universities, Harvard being one of them, there were lawsuits brought by Jewish students on those campuses. So on Harvard's campus, for example, saying that they didn't feel protected during these protests. On the other hand, the vast majority of protests were, of course, peaceful, and these were university students calling for their universities to divest from businesses that had ties to Israel, for example, and to call for a ceasefire. And so on the one hand, to Justin, to your point, on the one hand, we are seeing the specific, more narrow battle over universities on anti-Semitism. But on the other hand, this is a larger battle, isn't it? This is about this idea that these universities have become, quote, too woke, and that the Trump administration wants to rein them in and allow a flourishing of right-wing thought. They say that these universities are claiming free speech, but Republican students and right-wing thought has not been allowed to flourish.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you were describing there, Sumi. I spent some time on Columbia's campus and also talking to a student who went to NYU, New York University, in the summer, particularly around the issue of more around social media abuse and the impact of social media algorithms on the very polarized debate around the war in Gaza and the 7th of October attacks on Israel and how those had unfolded on the campuses there in New York. But there was absolutely that feeling from students, both Jewish students who felt like they hadn't been protected by their universities, and then also from students who were part of the pro-Palestinian movement who felt like they hadn't had kind of sufficient support, or they were being kind of wrongly targeted for protesting, wanting a ceasefire, for example. And it's just kind of interesting how it feels like this has kind of been born from that, but not just that. And I guess it's all kinds of other issues, isn't it, Justin, that there's been suggestions from Donald Trump's administration that universities lean a particular way and don't allow free debate or conversations around those topics.
Yeah. And there's a guy called Chris Rufo, who I think in a sense is one of the most powerful people kind of outside the administration and outside government. I don't know what you think about this, Sumi, but Chris Rufo has led a kind of one-man campaign against the universities on two real issues, partly on sex and gender, but actually much more on race, where he and a lot of his supporters say, you know what, the days when we racially discriminate and allow in certain numbers, quotas of people from each race, which the top universities have historically done in order to have diversity on campus, etc., that should all go. We should just be colorblind in our administration of everything, of justice, of academia, of everything. And Chris Rufo has taken an absolute scalpel to not just the top universities, actually, but a number of universities right around the country, where he's gone for the DEI schemes, and he has tried to get those universities first to defend them, which they weren't really expecting to have to do, and then when they couldn't defend them to his satisfaction, to try to get them defunded or harassed or whatever else, so that those schemes went. And Chris Rufo, I mean, it just seems to me, Sumi, he's not a famous person, certainly not outside the United States, and not really inside either, is he? But my goodness, he's had an impact.
He is, and in fact, there was a New York Times profile on him just last week, and we're seeing an increasing focus on who this person is. And while most people might not know who Chris Rufo is, the point is that you do have these figures within the administration and also outside of the administration that do wield a vast amount of power in the administration's approach to some of these issues. And by the way, we're talking about the administration's approach to universities, but this is also something that's affecting public schools across the country. So we have seen letters sent to public schools demanding that they end what is called DEI policies or DEI programs, and threatening to cut public funding to those schools. And interestingly, I was talking to family members who are connected with teachers, and they were saying that some of these teachers are extremely concerned because they say the approach that you just described, Justin, of kind of leveling out the playing field does not at all actually address some of the learning discrepancies there are between different types of children and in different communities. And, if you have special needs children, for example, in public schools, that they won't get the same type of teaching and learning and also attention that they need to be able to be on that level playing field. So it is this larger debate. But I mean, I think the point that you made, Justin, earlier about doing things that are popular, there is a sense, isn't there, among some Americans that particularly the universities, the Harvards, the Yales, and so on and so forth, that they are part of the elite establishment. And so in a way, you can imagine that a good number of Americans, certainly those who voted for Donald Trump, will actually support these policies.
Yeah. I mean, how many people, what proportion of Americans went to even a 4-year university, never mind Harvard, I think, is it around 40%, something like that?
I'd have to look that up, but that could certainly be
Where's
true.
Anthony? Where's
Yeah.
Anthony?
Where's Anthony where we need yeah.
Yeah, where's Anthony?
I think
exactly.
it's 40%. Look, I tell you what, I'm going to say I think it is 40%, and I know the producers who are very kind to me will just cut it out if it's wrong.
You were very kind to you. Watch yourself. So let's get into some of the specifics of what Donald Trump seemed to be asking Harvard and what Harvard has then taken issue with, and the kind of subsequent funding debate or withdrawal of funding that's happened. And to help us, we have none other than our own Donald Trump, Mike from Shrewsbury. He is a wonderful Americaster who does a very unique impression of Donald Trump for us. If you've not heard it before, certainly if you're listening on the World Service. This is him reading out Donald Trump's post on Truth Social.
Perhaps Harvard should lose its tax-exempt status and be taxed as a political entity if it keeps pushing political, ideological, and terrorist-inspired / supporting sickness. Remember, tax-exempt status is totally contingent on acting in the public interest.
Well, he could be in the room, couldn't he, as we always say. And people listening on the World Service who haven't heard Mike from Shrewsbury before will now have been introduced to it's just amazing. It just could actually be him. Anyway, thanks, Mike. Nice to hear from you again. And as to the substance of that, yeah, so there you go. Tax-exempt status. So in other words, Sumi, what he's saying is that an awful lot of Americans who have no hope at all of getting to Harvard are having to pay in some way, shape or form, if only because Harvard isn't paying its full whack in taxes, for the Harvard education that a few very elite people get. And it's the same, isn't it, as funding for NPR, National Public Radio, which he'd probably put in the same box as something that does get some federal funding. In other words, everyone contributes to it, but is now, certainly in Trumpian terms, seen as a far left progressive organization, and so shouldn't receive that funding. That's going to be the shtick, isn't it? And I wonder now how Harvard defends itself from that.
Yeah, so the tax exempt status is actually something that, if that were to be revoked, would mean a huge cost for universities. So the majority of universities are tax exempt. I went to Northwestern University, which, interestingly enough, is also facing a funding freeze from the Trump administration. But this was always a big issue with, it's just outside of Chicago on the water and has this beautiful waterfront view and is on basically the best property in that part of town.
Lovely
It
place.
is beautiful.
Proper
And
elite, Sumi, proper elite. You've placed yourself
we don't want anyone to know that.
right in there.
But the,
I mean, Justin, we can hardly talk.
yeah, exactly. Where did you go to university?
Let's move swiftly on. What were you saying about Northwestern, Sumi?
Well, just that it's on this beautiful waterfront piece of land. And there was always this bit of tension with the town because Northwestern is not paying taxes on that land. And you can imagine that for the town of Evanston, so where Northwestern is based, just outside of Chicago, as you know, Justin, it is obviously, a piece of land that would otherwise bring in a lot of revenue. And so the tax exempt status is something that the administration certainly can use as a stick. But if you look at some of the demands that were listed in the letter to Harvard obtained by the New York Times, I mean, if you look at what the administration wants to actually see from Harvard, they're saying reporting students to the federal government who are hostile to American values, ensuring each academic department is viewpoint diverse, hiring an external government-approved party to audit programs and departments, quote, that most fuel anti-Semitic harassment, and then checking faculty staff for plagiarism, which that last one obviously is something that the universities are struggling with at the moment anyways with large language models. But if you look at the demands here, I mean, the American values one is just also so squishy, isn't it? What exactly is being represented
What
by
does that
American
mean?
values? Yeah.
Yeah. And when you read those, it seems unsurprising that the response from Harvard was to say, hold on a second, not sure we're okay with this. And Harvard's president, Alan Garber, accused the White House of trying to control, to quote him, its community. He said, although some of the demands outlined by the government are aimed at combating anti-Semitism, the majority represent direct governmental regulation of the intellectual conditions at Harvard, to which the Department of Education then came back and said, Harvard's statement reinforces the troubling entitlement mindset that is endemic in our nation's most prestigious universities and colleges.
And just to put another finer point on the debate around universities here, this is also wrapped up in the canceling of visas for foreign students, right? Because we've seen, for example, a Tufts University student who was snatched off the streets and is being held in a detention center. And we understand at this point, through the court hearings that we've seen to this point, that what she had done is sign her name to an op-ed in the student newspaper at Tufts University, calling for the university to divest from business with Israel, and also calling on the university to listen to students. That's all the evidence that we've heard so far there is against a student. And so it seems here that for students who have expressed their opinion to support the Palestinian cause, that they are also being targeted by the administration.
And I guess the argument then would also be, if you're a university student or the university themselves who kind of oppose this idea of the points that have been laid out to them of things that the administration would like them to sort of adopt or adhere to, if they think about students who have right-leaning views, and I'm sure, Justin, you'll have stuff to say on this. There are examples of where people have been sort of cancelled or sort of excommunicated, I guess, from student bodies. But there is a difference between that and then being sort of actively taken from the streets and put in a detention centre and stuff like that. And you can see how the images of that, like that clip you described, Sumi, has gone so viral on social media. I mean, I've seen loads and loads of content about it because people are kind of shocked by it. They're like, hang on, this is America. Why are people being taken off the streets for what they say or think? That seems very at odds with what the First Amendment would describe. But that could also be applied to people on the right who have, for example, had, contracts terminated or jobs stopped or weren't able to be part of a university anymore in the US or in other places.
I tell you what, Sumi, we were discussing a few weeks ago now, Ezra Klein, the New York Times journalist, making the really fascinating point that the entire administrative state, when Donald Trump goes after whether it's the US aid organization or whether it's, any number of federal bodies that he's either closed or sacking everyone or trying to get rid of, or the universities or the broadcasters, there's this kind of weird thing, which Ezra Klein, who's a Democrat supporter, says has happened, where actually it is a fact in the modern era that they do all tend to be staffed by liberal people, left-wing people. It's the kind of mirror image of the Senate, where you have 2 senators from every state, and so you tend to have a kind of overrepresentation of rural people and rural interests, and in the modern era of Republican interests. But in the administrative state, it's sort of the opposite. And there is, I think, Ezra Klein's point, which we've discussed before, and is an interesting one, isn't it, is that there is room for some sort of a rebalancing, even if the Trump administration does in the end go too far.
It is I was listening to that as well from Ezra Klein, and it is fascinating to think about. And also the type of people who decide to make a career in government, right? And I remember this even from my time living in Germany, that there was always a sense that within the government, rather, and in the ministries in Germany, that there was a liberal bias, that you had people who would tend to go to university, who would tend to choose a career working in government, would also tend to be more liberal. That's also, by the way, very much the accusation made against journalists, isn't it? And I know that's the case in the UK as well as here in the US.
And so what do we think happens next? I mean, obviously this $2.2 billion of funding has been frozen to Harvard. How much of an impact will that have? Do you think that will actually, they really do need that money and therefore they will decide that maybe this isn't the hill to die on and they'll sort of fall on their sword? Or is it actually no, we're going to stick to our principles and we can kind of cope without this money, and this rumbles on and extends far beyond Harvard, and we've already seen it kind of touch some other universities too?
I put that question to a few voices from Harvard, students at the Crimson, the student newspaper, and also a law professor. And it's not entirely clear yet. I mean, the university itself could choose to actually sue the Trump administration, which would escalate this all to another level. But they are very clear that they feel that they can make the case to Americans as well, that these cuts are not just for liberal students, are not going to just impact liberal students on our campus who are quote unquote anti-American. Also, it will impact funding for health, and also funding for research into cancer and many things things. And also, they have said that this type of research is something that is going to impact all Americans. And so they're hoping that that message that they take to the American public will actually convince people that the Trump administration's threat of a funding freeze will convince people that it's not going to impact the university in the way that you think. It remains to be seen how Harvard actually will proceed with this. And I think what's going to be a decisive factor is how many universities stand up with Harvard alongside Harvard. We saw Columbia University cede to some of the Trump administration's demands when they were facing a funding freeze. And they're in the middle of this kind of back and forth negotiation with the Trump administration. And if you see a number of universities start to stand up and say, no, we will not accept these demands, that could change the equation for Harvard a bit as well.
Yeah. I know also, as we were saying right at the beginning, this is a fight they want to have, but it's actually the fight that they want to have more than the result potentially. I mean, I don't think the administration would mind having a fight for the whole of this term of Donald Trump's time in the White House. It kind of keeps people on their toes and keeps people G'd up. So I'm not necessarily thinking they actually kind of, I don't know, send in stormtroopers to close something down, but I do think it's a fight that they are going to carry on with, and it's a fight if the universities want to have it. It's a fight they're going to find very difficult to win. Hey, we've gone the whole distance without talking about tariffs, which is a good thing because not just because the word tariff is a rather boring one, yeah. But
it's like that game of like if you say the game, then you lose the game.
Yeah. Anyway, I've now said it. I've said it and lost it. But the point is, there is so much happening, isn't there, that we just lose. And it's our job to keep an eye on, partly, I think, because people listen to Americast in order to hear things that aren't necessarily always in the headlines. And on that subject, we've had a text from Darren in Melbourne, Australia, who says this: Trump has a way of creating distractions in order to enact changes we then find out about later. Would you consider a semi-regular segment called What Are We Missing? This is one from Mike from Shrewsbury, I think, or maybe Darren could voice it up. Anyway, whenever Trump seems to be flooding the zone, take a step back, Darren says, and investigate what else is going on in the shadows, which I think is a great idea. And Mariana, you're gonna take and run with it.
I am. I feel like anything that asks what else is going on in the shadows is right up my street.
You live in them.
As ever. I live in the shadows. The shadows aren't really the shadows. And I've been hanging out on my Undercover Voters feeds, my fictional characters with all their different social media profiles. And something which some Americasters might have seen and certainly has been popping up on the Undercover Voters accounts are these TikToks coming out of China. And they've been going on all of this week. And I'm sorry, Justin, but they do relate to tariffs. Well, they relate to these huge tariffs that have been imposed by the US on China and Chinese products. And then China's kind of done the same in this sort of tariff ding dong, for want of a better word, that's going on between the two countries. And it's interesting because TikTok, like the TikTok version of TikTok that you could use in China, has been for quite a long time very different to the Western TikTok, like the TikTok that we use, like the TikTok that people in the States use. And so on the whole, certainly I have not seen this, and the Undercover Voters have never been recommended stuff that's from China directly, that's like, you know, Chinese content creators and that kind of thing, not least because it probably wouldn't be what the algorithm would push them. And yet their feeds have been absolutely overwhelmed by these videos of Chinese factory workers describing the kinds of work they're doing for big American brands, like high-end products, the stuff that costs loads and loads of dollars, like really expensive stuff, saying, look, actually, we do this so cheaply and we're making all this stuff in this warehouse, and you know, you could actually just buy it for $6 here, but they're making you pay all of this money. And it's so interesting the way that this kind of stuff has become, I mean, like the content on TikTok is effectively a tool in this tariff war that's going on, because it's kind of saying to Americans, like, you were being ripped off anyways. There is a kind of argument about how accurate or fair some of the stuff they're saying is, and there have been suggestions that actually some of it's quite misleading, and there are some misinformation about particular brands suggesting, you know, that the costs they've estimated and stuff aren't necessarily spot on. But there is this kind of highlighting of the fact that China makes huge amounts of stuff that Americans buy and use all the time. And you could just see, in terms of the impact that it has for Donald Trump, that if you're the average American, particularly maybe a younger American who uses TikTok, and you're being pushed this stuff, you do think, hang on a second, how and why has it been working like this? I'm not so sure about this. And also perhaps that feeling of, I mean, maybe it's good for Donald Trump because you realise, oh, okay, maybe it would be better if we made this stuff ourselves and maybe in the long term it would be cheaper. Or the flip side, which is, oh, actually, we've been being kind of conned for ages and China are kind of trying to say, look, like we're not the bad guys, order directly from us. So it's an interesting sort of thing that's been popping up, which hasn't been in the headlines, but certainly has been all over social media.
I think that is absolutely fascinating because of TikTok's status. So remember, it's meant to be shut down. I mean, there was an act of Congress, wasn't there, Sumi? The thing should not be
Yes.
there, and it's been kept alive in a kind of semi-legal way. And everyone has assumed that Donald Trump's kept it alive because he thinks come the next election, it could be owned by someone in America, maybe Elon Musk, maybe someone else, and pressure could be put on the algorithms to kind of kick it in the direction of the Republicans. We assume it won't be Donald Trump, but whether it's JD Vance or whoever, and that actually it could be a helpful thing. But it's really interesting if Mariana's right that it's sort of been hijacked by the Chinese now in exactly the way that people warned would happen.
It's fascinating. And, to your point about ownership of TikTok, I mean, President Trump has said, hasn't he, I did really well with young people, and TikTok is a big reason for that. And they're very, he's been very candid about that he wants TikTok to stick around. And so they've talked about this 50% model where you'd have a 50% American ownership and ByteDance the other 50%. It's not really clear how that would work or if that would even follow the guidelines of what Congress has actually ruled. But on the other hand, now China has said because of these tariffs, any sort of discussion about TikTok is now off the table. So that puts us back to quote unquote square one, if you will, because we don't know where that negotiation will go from here. But if the Trump administration wants to keep it, and Mariana, what you're describing is happening, I mean, this is going to be quite difficult for them to combat. And I do find it really interesting that when you talk about or even look at some of the polling among Americans here, if they are concerned about tariffs, it's not necessarily the tariffs on China. They see China as a real economic adversary. And from the first Trump term to now, we really have seen on both sides of the aisle this growing distrust of China, specifically on trade, but also on national security, on geopolitics, and so on and so forth. And so when you actually look at the numbers on how Americans feel about tariffs on China, even if those tariffs are extremely high, 145%, there seems to be an understanding or acceptance of it. But at the same time, the Chinese economy and the U.S. economy are so deeply integrated in terms of the type of products that Americans are used to buying at very low cost. And when you start to look at just how much Chinese goods have really dominated the U.S. market in your everyday store, I do wonder if that opinion will start to change, specifically in your stores like Walmart and such, among low-income families who are very dependent upon being able to buy those goods at a low price.
Yeah, and it's worth saying as well, TikTok, although on the whole, the user base does tend to skew younger, it actually has a whole range of different people that use it, including like middle-aged and some older people, and also people from all sort of different economic backgrounds and stuff like that. And this idea that you're actually being directly and actively shown, look, actually, all of this stuff is actually made in China. You can see how people then connect it up to their real lives and think, oh, wow, okay. Yeah. As a concept, I was kind of okay with this because maybe I thought, China are an adversary of the States and I can deal with that. But now it's like, oh, actually, this just affects like my day-to-day life and what I want to buy. And, I'm not sure how I feel about it. It's worth saying as well, just on this point about, the accusations that have been leveled at TikTok and its parent company ByteDance have been connected to the Chinese government, the Chinese state in some way. TikTok and ByteDance have always repeatedly rejected that accusation. And part of their argument to Donald Trump, well, certainly to the administration, in terms of delaying the ban, like this kind of reprieve, there's 90 days and then 75 days, this extension to allow them to come up with a new plan for ownership. They've repeatedly spoken about how that's just absolutely not the case and it's wrong to say that. You can imagine that this kind of thing, and again, kind of there's no evidence to support the idea that the Chinese government have sat there and gone, right, great, let's click this button and all this content's going to appear on American users' feeds. That's not the case. But you can see how if you lift some of the different barriers to you change the way some users are using it in China, and then obviously lots of people in the States are interested and concerned about, say, the tariffs or just generally politics. This content starts to get traction. It appears on their feed, etc., etc. It does kind of undermine a little bit TikTok's argument of, even if it's accidental, like even if it's just a kind of quirk of the algorithm and it's because people care about this stuff, it still sort of doesn't look that great to the Trump administration, who'll be thinking, hold on a second, it sort of feels like this site is being used to influence American opinion in a way that we don't like very much. And maybe, is it that beneficial to us or not?
I wonder as well, Sumi, whether the whole Walmart thing, the kind of Christmas decorations in Walmart, has kind of corrupted Americans' view of China. I think they still think of it as being essentially a kind of giant sweatshop where very low grade things are made by people in terrible conditions and then shipped enormously cheaply across the world. They have no idea about how technologically advanced China is.
That's true.
And you think of the various competitors to Tesla that there are, but also more than that, just the ability of the Chinese. They assume, and I think the American media have kind of fed into this message. And as you said right at the start, it's a bipartisan thing, this kind of view of China, not just that China is an adversary and a potential enemy of the United States, but also that it's a bit rubbish, really. It's still not kind of making the grade. And whatever you think of China and its human rights abuses and its military threat and all the rest of it, it has been a place of the most extraordinary technical prowess, even in the last kind of 2 or 3 years, isn't it?
We haven't even mentioned AI and the real concerns that have been brought up here with DeepSeek and the ability that DeepSeek has actually exhibited and the concerns that the Americans have on falling behind in the AI race. Yeah, certainly. You're absolutely right that, there has always been this view of the Chinese economy in the US as producing low cost, low quality goods. And that simply isn't the case anymore. And if you look at the fact that, China is now restricting the export to the US of certain materials, so heavy earths and things that are used for the most high tech products that the US makes, not only electric cars, but things like weapons and also some of their semiconductor materials that are made here as well. That is going to be a serious blow for the U.S. National security and defense industry as well. So those are things that Americans don't necessarily connect to the Chinese economy and to that economic relationship, but they will feel it if this trade war continues to escalate.
Just to finish off on the TikTok stuff, it's worth saying as well that the company haven't publicly commented on all this stuff that's going on. But there have been some videos of some of these creators who say they're, Chinese suppliers and say that they're connected to some of these big American brands that have been taken down. Unclear exactly why they've been removed, but there are quite big questions over how legitimately some of these factories are suppliers, particularly because often some of those suppliers would have to sign NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, and that kind of stuff wouldn't even be public necessarily. So it's quite hard to A, verify, and then B, like, is that really the case? Or is this all kind of part of a trade war TikTok off, which might not be necessarily based on evidence?
TikTok off sounds Russian.
TikTok off sounds Russian.
Yeah. Anyway, look, I think we're just about out of time. Just to say, though, and I want to bring this up, George, our producer, has done some internet research, he says, and he's discovered that around 40% of people in the United States do go to university, 4-year course at university.
Justin, you were right. See,
I was right. We don't need Anthony. We'll never hear from him again. Although George rather annoyingly says it could be higher in the last few years. So I don't know what that means. But anyway, yeah, it is roughly 40%. So basically most Americans, as we were saying, don't even go to these universities, let alone the very top ones. Whether or not that matters politically, well, we will see, will we not? Actually, I've got a question for you, Sumi, as well before we go. Do you give money to Northwestern University? Because the thing that always
Justin,
strikes
you're really
me about
putting
my
me on the spot.
American
What if they're
friends,
listening?
they give a ton of money to the universities, and here in Britain, generally speaking, Mariana, you may be an exception, we don't. And that it's one of the reasons why it's one of the reasons why they've got these huge endowments, because people, when they do really well, as you have, they feel a kind of obligation to pay back. It's a fascinating sort of difference between their system and certainly the system in the UK.
It is, and now I feel like a real Scrooge when I say I don't give to Northwestern. I give to my high school where I went, which is a wonderful school and really set me on my way in journalism. And so that's where I give. I hope no one from Northwestern is listening to this.
That's it. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Right, that is it for today's edition of Americast. Thank you hugely for listening from all of us. Goodbye.